So, to continue with our discussion in adaptation as a product of evolution and natural selection. So, one of the example of the adaptation as a product of natural selection is the distribution of big sizes with a pinch population, which is or wherein the changes is in response to the extreme climate change, particularly what we so called La Nina. So this particular La Nina altered the weather patterns over the Galapagos, causing severe drought. So in cases of severe drought and a small amount of precipitation, the seed production declined drastically. So small seeds declined in abundance faster than large seeds did, so increasing the average seed size and hardness which is available. So this particular scenario or case in the Galapagos made or contributed to the change in the beak sizes of the finches. So in this case, there are phenotypic changes due to the availability or the type of food that they consume. So the decline in food resources resulted to 85% decline in the finch population due to mortality and possible immigration. So those that are capable of consuming hard seeds and large size seeds tend to adopt. However, some did not and some did migrate to other places. So as you can see here in this figure, so there's the number of finches and the year, including the months. So as you can see, from 1975, there's fluctuating population of finches, which drastically dropped from 1976 to 1977, and increase and fluctuate within 1978. So in the lower figure, you can see the percent survival and the bill depth. So based on that particular scenario, as you can see, if you have an increasing bill depth, there is an increasing rate or percentage of survivability or survival. It is because these particular size of bill depth can actually consume hard seeds and large sized seeds. So as you can see, pag tumataas yung bill depth mo, since yun ay adapted mismo sa hard na seeds, then the survival rate is increasing or the survival percentage is increasing. Okay. So there is a term called target selection. So the target selection is the phenotype that is directly acted upon by selective forces. In the previous case, the selective force there is the availability or the type of food that they consume. So in this case, the target selection is the beak size for Galapagos finches. Okay, so those large beak sizes had the tendency to consume hard seeds. Then they have the ability to survive or higher percentage of survival. So the selective agent is the environmental pressure that results in fitness differences among individuals, which is now the type of food. For example, you have the seed size and abundance for Galapagos finches. So you have the target selection, which is the phenotype of the organism, and the selective agent. It could be part of the environment, particularly in this example, that is their food source. So natural selection has different types, okay, so that affects the distribution of the population of the phenotype. So first we have directional selection. In this particular type of selection, there is one specific trait that is being favored or extremely favored as compared to the other trait, while stabilizing selection occurs when the mean value of the trait is favored. Kumbaga, there is a specific um, um, or it's between the center, not at the extreme both ends of a particular trait that is being favored. Okay, and you have disruptive selection, so occurs when members of the population are subjected to different selection pressures, which is responsible, this type of selection is responsible for the creation of new species, or what we so called speciation. So since they are adopted, or they are subjected to different selection pressure. Okay, so we have a graph representation here of the different types of selection. So as you can see, for the directional selection, or what we so called positive selection, so there is an extreme phenotype that is favored over the other. So if you try to um, have this one at both ends, you have two types of trait that is being tested by environmental pressure. So in this case, a particular trait is being favored in this favorable trait, or organisms that exhibit this favorable trait has a higher tendency to survive and reproduce. Okay, so this particular type of selection was described by Charles Darwin itself in his book The Origin of Species. Okay, so in this case also, the advantageous allele increases as a consequence of differences in survival and reproduction among different phenotypes. Okay. So for stabilizing selection, dito naman, as what it is defined in the previous slide, or as how it is defined in the previous slide, you have here the mean value of a specific trait. Okay. So there is stabilization in the mean value of a particular trait. So you cannot actually, or there is no specific trait that is being favored, or there is no extreme, non-extreme trait value that is being favored. Okay. So, this is thought to be the most common mechanism of action for natural selection because most traits do not appear to change drastically over time. Hindi naman kasi nangyayari yung changes over a short period of time. It took several years or a longer period of time to occur. So, stabilizing selection uses negative selection to select against extreme values of the character. Okay. So, because most traits change little over time, ito yung pinaka-common. It is said to be the most common type of selection. And the third type is the um, disruptive selection pattern. So in this case, if you have the graph here, the selection pressure, there is different selection pressure being introduced in one population, for example. So the introduction of different pressures or environmental pressures causes now the separation of the population into two, creating what we so called new species. So ito yung dahilan kung bakit nagkakaroon ng speciation, the disruptive selection. So since the population is subjected to different types of environmental pressure. So this is actually a very understandable graph. So for directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection. Okay. So not all phenotypes represents adaptation in response to natural selection, since there are different factors that affects natural selection, particularly in the changes of, or their what's so-called genetic variation. So first we have mutation. So mutation happen in um, within the gene, the chromosome, part of during cell division process, specifically um, reproductive cells. So it causes phenotypic changes to the offspring. And there's another type of factor. You have the genetic drift. So changes in the allele frequency due to the random chance associated with sexual reproduction. This has something to do with um, the law of genetics. There's random selection. You have the the law of independent assortment. So different types of or different genotypes independently segregate with each other, or independent type of allele segregate independent from each other. So there's random changes in the small, or this causes random changes in a small population. You have the genetic drift. So for migration is the movement of individuals between local populations. So as what I have said, like of the finches, for those who are not adapted or cannot resist with the type of food available in that particular habitat, they tend to, of course, not survive or die, or they can actually transfer to from that place to another in search for food. So that particular migration pattern creates now a local population. Okay, so there are tendencies that within that local population magkakaroon ng phenotypic variation, ayan, which may cause the production of new species or a new subspecies for that large population. And you have the gene flow, so the transfer of genes from one population to another. So exchange of genes, if, especially for populations that are not geographically isolated. Okay. For example, I think this is taught in zoology. You have the allopatric speciation or allopatry, or sympatric population, or sympatry. So for allopatric, there are in allopatric you have two exclusive populations, but they are adjacent with each other. So there are instances that there would be crossing from one population to another, and you have also the sympatric speciation or sympatry, wherein two or more populations in some area, um, within the same area, should I say, with the overlapping. So within that particular overlap, species tend to may interbreed or may meet within that overlap, and may uh, create a subpopulation or small or localized population, where they can actually do that through interbreeding. So the geographic range of the species can result to phenotypic variation of neighboring populations. As what I have said, you have allopatry and sympatry. So a wider geographic range includes a broader range of environmental conditions. So they tend to be subjected in different types of environmental conditions if they are occupying a wide range or wide geographical range. So the greater distance between two populations, the more pronounced the phenotypic differences, especially for those which are geographically isolated. Okay? So if there are barriers, for example, if you are aware in biogeography that there are lines in or invisible lines within the Southeast Asia, which causes the formation of different species from, for example, in unique species of Indonesia, unique species in the Philippines. It is because they have this theory that there is invisible line that separates these different islands. So nagkakaroon ng maraming species in two set of islands. Okay? So there are also cases that populations are bounded or separated by mountainous areas, for example, so they tend to have phenotypic differences. So, pwedeng ganun ang mangyari. So, they are geographically isolated, most probably. Okay. So, in natural selection, you have what we saw called cline. So, cline is a measurable gradual change over um, a geographic region in the average of a specific phenotypic trait. So clines are usually associated with environmental gradients such as temperature, moisture, light, and even altitude. So clinal differences exist in the body proportion, size, coloration, and physiological adaptation among animals. So for example, here you have within the Central America and North America white-tailed deer, as you can see, nakikita nyo naman yung differences within their antlers. Okay? So, yan. So, aside from this, it is noted that they also, the clinal variation can also exist in their body weight. Okay, nagba-vary din sila sa weight nila. So, in this figure here, makikita nyo na um, magkaiba yung ano, skull structure nung dalawang ng North American white-tailed deer. It is because this is what we so-called clinal variation. Ayan. So, but they are of the same species, the white-tailed deer. You have, yan. So they have just what we so-called a clinal variation, that specific phenotypic variation. But do not be confused, they are still of the same species. Okay. So for this portion here, you have an ecotype, specific population adapted to its unique, often abrupt local environment. So in this case, you have the yarrow. So there are variation in terms of its height. So at lower latitude, they tend to, or the lower altitude, they tend to be with longer length as compared to those species or those individuals that are within the higher altitudes. You can say that this particular species has a higher range of altitudinal gradient or can actually resist a wide range of altitudinal gradient. However, they tend to adapt to that particular elevation by reducing their height. So one of the main reason why plants do exhibit stunted growth at higher elevation, it is because of strong winds that tend to or exerts a lot of force, which causes the bending or even pagbali ng mga stem. Kaya they tend to adapt to that, and then they tend to have a shorter what we call shorter length to avoid such damage to the plants. So we have an ecotype, population adapted to its unique local environmental condition. Okay. So you have also what we call geographic isolates, result when gene flow among subpopulation is prevented. So this is what I am saying, that for example, in this figure, within this particular region, there are actually land masses that tend to isolate some of these species, okay? Where there is actually the formation of subspecies because they are geographically isolated. So these isolated subpopulation are often classified as subspecies, or there are other scientists that would consider them as another species. So they are geographically isolated from each other. And we have also the adaptive radiation, wherein it is actually the process of having multiple species from one common species or tinatawag na ancestral species, it is because they are subjected to different features of environment, just like of food. In this case, we have an example here. We have the finches. So they are subjected to different food types, so they have unique characteristic or unique features of their beaks depending on their food that they eat. So, however, these different types of finches do have their what we so called ancestral species. So, from the ancestral species, okay, ancestral group, they are subjected to different environmental features just like of food, kaya nagkakaroon ng different types or different species. So, that is adaptive radiation. Okay. So, meron din tayong tinatawag na phenotypic plasticity, so ability of the genotype to give rise to different phenotypes in different environmental conditions. So, the norm reaction is the set of phenotypes expressed by a single genotype across the range of environmental conditions. So, in this case, this is very basic to plants. It is because plants tend to or plants are known, especially some parts of the plants like of the leaves, known to be phenotypically plastic. Ibig sabihin, they tend to adjust or the structure of this particular part of the plant tend to adjust to the existing environmental condition. For example, if you have two species which are both adapted to shaded environment as well as of the exposed environment, so there are tendencies that most of these species under shaded condition tend to expand or to have broader leaves as compared to the same species na nandoon sa exposed area. Kasi since the sun is already available, they tend to reduce their leaf size in order to prevent wilting, at the same time prevent too much transpiration or can even cause leaf damage. Ayan. So, aside from the leaf shape or the leaf size, you have also the size of the plant. The same is true with our example in the previous slide. They tend to have stunted growth in higher elevated areas as compared to lower elevated areas. And I have mentioned to you what is the reason for that. Okay? So the ratio of reproductive tissue to vegetative tissue is also one of the example of phenotypic plasticity, especially when um, they tend to be wind pollinated or just depend on wind for pollination. Ayan. So they tend to produce a high number of reproductive structure in order for their what we so called reproductive success of the species. Okay. Okay, so this will be the last slide. Okay, so I hope you have understood natural selection, evolution, as well as the inclusion of genetics to those two processes. And adaptation as a product of evolution by natural selection.